I read Pattern Master by Octavia Butler, and I'm going to be reading the entire Patternist series. This is the plan, which this is typically seen as the final book in the Patternist series. But I want to read it as the first book and kind of go in quote unquote reverse order because this is the order that the books were written in. And I think that there's something to be had in examining the books in the order that they were written. And so there's 4 books. I'm not going to include the 5th book, Survivor, because Butler says that she doesn't consider it to be a worthy part of the series. And also it's extremely expensive, or I would have to like pirate a PDF of it or something like that. And so I just am not comfortable pirating a book, and I'm not in a position to pay for a really expensive book. And since the author says that it's not a part of the series anyway, I'm not going to include it. So there are 4 books in the Patternist series. I'm only going to talk about this book for this podcast. And then in the next book, I would talk about this book and the next book and so on and so forth. So Pattern Master is the story of Teray, who is a kind of mutant psychic human far in the future. I think this is like in the 23rd or 24th century, something like that. Pretty far in the future. And Teray is part of a network of telepathic humans who the network is called the Pattern, and the leader or master of the whole thing is the Pattern Master. So that's where the novel gets its name. And it turns out that Teray is the son of the Pattern Master, and therefore probably has the ability to become the new Pattern Master. Rael, the current Pattern Master, is ailing and needs to be replaced. He's not fulfilling his role as the leader properly, and so he needs to be supplanted, and this means that he would be killed. It doesn't seem like in this network of power, it doesn't seem like there can be more than one person for any given role, and that there is a need to remove rivals completely by killing them. But Teray is young and he doesn't understand how to use his powers or the limits of his powers. And so there's a little bit of coming of age here, but it's not a normal coming of age as you would typically see it in a fantasy or even a science fiction novel. I think that Butler is doing something here where you have a naive hero, like what's in a lot of coming of age novels, but his naivete has to do with how power is used and how power is transferred, and the utter brutality of this civilization that Teray is a part of, and how he needs to shed his empathy and all of his softness in order to take his place at the head of the Pattern. And so usually in these kind of coming of age stories, there's like a loss of innocence, but a gaining of wisdom that leads to a more civilized, less violent hero, a hero who deploys violence in order to achieve some kind of noble goal, in terms of like social norms. But I think what's really shocking about this book is the way in which Teray needs to like shed all of his more civilized instincts and become more brutal. Because the picture of the future that Butler is painting is that everything in society has degenerated in many ways. And so slavery is massively common. Technology has enormously declined. And the hierarchies of power that exist within the Pattern are the most important elements of society. And so there's not a whole lot of community building. There's very little personal freedom that anybody has. The lower ranked you are in the hierarchy of the pattern, the more apt you are to be exploited by the people higher up in the hierarchy. And it can happen to you like at any given time. And so this network links the minds of all of the psychic people together into a group, and people who are both higher up, quote unquote, and close together, quote unquote, people who have similar dispositions, talents, and power levels are kind of closer together in the pattern. And those people are able to link up and share their power with each other in ways that they can't if they're trying to link up with somebody who is of a vastly different power level or a different kind of disposition or has different talents and stuff like that. And what this means is that the people who are more powerful can grab onto someone less powerful than them in the pattern and just literally take the life force right out of them and can kill their body by kind of just taking over their mind and just taking all of their energy away and making it their own energy. And then the person would just like drop dead. And the pattern master himself could do this like to everyone if he really wanted to. And so it's a kind of brutal metaphor for networks of power and for government kind of writ large, I think. I think there's also something here about patriarchy. The pattern master is a man. Teray is a man. His rival, who's also his brother, Karansi, is a man. And the way that power is used, the fact that it's being given from father to son or taken from father to son seems very patriarchal to me as well. That being said, there are some women in the book, and there's one important woman, Amber, who is a healer. And we see that there are different kinds of psychic abilities that are explored throughout the book. So a healer is somebody who has this very fine-tuned ability to sense the outside and inside of a body and can manipulate telekinesis to affect the body. And so like they could reach into somebody's body telepathically, I guess, and kind of telekinetically heal internal wounds or maybe get rid of cancer or isolate viruses and then purge them, all without doing any kind of like surgery with a knife. And we see this happen in the book where there are these creatures called clayarchs who are outside of the patternist society completely and are considered monsters. And the healer, Amber, is able to sense their circulatory system and then like burst their carotid artery inside of their body, instantly killing them. And then there are other psychic powers, like the kind of thing that Teray and Karansi can do, where that's just a matter of like, that's regular telekinesis and also telepathy, where you can read people's minds, but you can also like pick stuff up with your mind and throw it around and whatnot. Then there are people who are called artists who can take a memory and implant it into some kind of object. And so you have Teray uses something like this at one point in the book where he's able to pick up an object and he lives through the memory of another person. And it's a fully embodied memory where he's hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, just like as if he was actually there, whatever happened in the memory. Then there are people who can take their entire like experience and memories and things like that and just kind of download them to other people. And so this also happens in the story between Teray and a guy named Joachim, who teaches him how to deal with another group of people in the story called mutes. And he teaches him like everything that he knows about mutes instantaneously by just like opening his mind to him. And so the mutes are basically people who are like us, just like normal people who don't have any telepathic abilities, and they don't have any of the monstrous qualities of the Clayarchs. And they operate basically as like slaves to the psychic people in the pattern. And they don't even have free will or anything. They're just completely dominated by the telepathic powers of everyone around them. And they don't even experience like resentment about their slavery because they're just like brainwashed to enjoy it. It's a really chilling portrayal of slavery that is just like not even remarkable to Teray and the other characters. They don't see anything wrong with it, really. Teray has a little bit of sympathy for the mutes, but he doesn't see like a fundamental human dignity problem. It's like he's magnanimously, like the mutes are pretty smart, for mutes, kind of an attitude. And you can see also throughout the story that because of all these psychic powers, that's a big part of the reason why there's been such a technological decline, because there's no use for all kinds of technology when you can just move things around with your mind or just instantaneously communicate with people by simply thinking about it. So there's no use for like, cell phones and stuff like that, or even entertainment products like television, video games and stuff, because you can pick up objects and then just live out the life of a person whose memories have been implanted into the object. And there's no need for complicated weapons that might need to be loaded and that take a lot of time if you can reach out psychically and attack people with your thoughts. And so the pattern people don't even really own weapons, but we see that the Clayarchs use rifles and guns a lot. So it's not that the patternists are necessarily anti-technology. There's just really no need for it, and they don't allow the mutes to have their own culture or like normal existence, and therefore the mutes don't really cultivate any technology of their own either. And because the patternists are the primary like dominant culture group in the world, technology has massively declined. It also seems like sometime in the past there was really dangerous, brutal wars, like a World War III kind of situation, and that there was a breakdown in global government systems that's led to this, compounded by the fact that like psychic people took over and enslaved everybody without psychic powers. So something went terribly wrong in the past in terms of like our culture's sense of progress, and has led to this state of affairs that's like extremely brutal. It reminds me of Hobbesian type philosophy, Thomas Hobbes. I mean, Hobbes is a complicated character, he's like a real person, but like his philosophy is more complicated than the thing I'm about to say. But the thing that he's known for is this idea of a state of nature for humanity, and that state of nature being every person against every other person, a war of every person against every other person is kind of his idea of, if we just stripped civilization out, that is at our core what people are. And then the reason that we form governments is to kind of protect ourselves from that ceaseless war with every other individual. So rather than be afraid of everybody around us all the time, we make groups together and we choose leaders from amongst ourselves who will protect us from all of the other people who are outside of the group. And that is kind of the construction that you see here in the patternist society. The pattern master extends protection for everybody against the Clayarchs who are constantly competing with them for territory and food. And so the threat of the Clayarchs keeps people invested in the pattern to the degree that like they need it in order to survive. And so there's not people rebelling against the brutal control that the pattern master can inflict on them. But I don't even know if they would actually have the capacity to rebel against the pattern master anyway. And there's this other kind of theme that's happening that's really, really interesting and can't be accounted for in Hobbes' system, where there's a kind of biological imperative to the way that powers work in the patternist series. So we've got this rivalry between Teray and Carancy. Carancy positions himself as being the most powerful psychic in the world who is not the pattern master. And his power is so immense that if he tries to like access the power of someone else within the pattern and like form a link with them, he won't be able to stop himself from trying to form a link with the entire pattern and take it over from his father. Like there's a biological compulsion, in other words, for him to try and take that space that is the patternist space as if he was made to do that, is kind of what I'm saying. And he doesn't have full control of himself for that reason. It's a similar thing with Amber, where she just kind of quote unquote naturally has this disposition to heal people because she can like feel the very fine layers of all of their biology and therefore is able to, heal people. And so just by reaching out with her power, she has almost no choice, or it feels very natural to do the things that she does. And this is how all of the more powerful, like the more powerful you are psychically, the more compelled you are to use your powers in particular ways, which is a really interesting twist on this whole Hobbesian thing, where it's almost like there's a teleological kind of impulse in people, but it's biological and not chosen. And so I think part of the tension for Teray's journey is not just that his father Rael is infected with this Clayarch disease that's killing him and he needs to get replaced by his son. That's not the only thing going on. It's that there is this need within Teray to take the spot that he's literally kind of made for. And he can't actually fight against that. In trying to be something else, he's fighting his very essence. And it's as if, Teray has a will over here on one side, but his kind of biology on the other side over here is dominating his destiny. And so he has no choice but to obey his biology, or I guess to die would be the alternative. To end his biological life would end that struggle, but it would also cause him to cease to exist. And so there is a sense in which, and this is a theme that Butler goes over again and again, we have a split between who we are essentially as people and our biology. There's a sense of rebellion. But I think for Teray's journey, he specifically kind of has to step into this biological role to fully complete himself and take over the pattern. It's kind of horrifyingly posed as like a good thing, I think. So it's like everybody wants, all of the good characters that we like, the quote unquote good ones in the story, want Teray to be the pattern master because he's a better choice than his brother Carancy, who is cruel and vindictive and petty. But nonetheless, the pattern is a brutal system of supremacy and domination. And so whoever is at the top of it is literally going to be like a slave master, that that it is a master and slave kind of relationship. But it's as if it is biologically demanded of him to be a slave master, which is just a really fascinating idea that I think kind of pulls at our notions of race, right? It's because for so long in American history, it was posited that one race had a destiny to be slaves and the other race had a destiny to be slave masters. And that was biologically imprinted, or, it was a hierarchy put in place by God. And so this kind of makes a metaphor or allegory out of that in a very like literal way. He has no choice but to be a slave master. It's like biologically imprinted in him. And so I think by literalizing this kind of racism, slavery narrative, making the biology actually true, like Butler is basically asking, like, what if that was really true? What would the world be like? It's a nightmare for everyone, not just the slaves, but the slave masters. Like, as horrifying as life is for the mutes, it's somehow like even as bad or worse for Teray and Caranci and Rael, who are at the top of the hierarchy. Like, there's no good position in this network of power in terms of like being a whole free human being. There is no freedom because like you're caught by the pattern itself, and it fundamentally changes your relationship to who you are at your core. And so Butler has like really captured something in all of the complicated world building that she has. And then additionally to that, to like further underline this kind of race difference theme that she has, you have literally the Clayarchs are a different kind of human being than the mutes and patternists. And so they have like animal-like qualities. They kind of look like cats or something. But then they also are able to talk, and they use tools like guns and other things. Meanwhile, if they have any human qualities at all, they indulge in cannibalism. They will eat the bodies of their victims, just like an animal would. And so they are like truly something other than human, and they are like an entirely different race. But at the same time, they are somehow able to infect the humans and the patternists, the psychic people, with whatever it is that they are. And so this kind of touches on one of the greatest fears of American racism, the kind of being infected, having purity among the races, and then having crossover, that there is a kind of infection or disgust that happens when the races are crossed over. And so when a Clayarch crosses over with a human, then the results are that it turns the human monstrous. There is no cross infection the other way. There's only ever a kind of degenerate crossover that happens. There's an assimilation into Clayarchness that has to do with like feral, animalistic otherness. And that's what's happened to Rael. He has been infected with the Clayarch disease, and he's dying of it. And eventually his psyche is going to be transformed into another race. So this is kind of the racist nightmare, that somehow like the white supremacist is going to be supplanted or displaced by the mixing with the other races. And this mixing can happen like instantaneously. It doesn't even need to take generations in this story. And this feud between them that has to do with like resources and land is completely destroying both civilizations' capacity to exist in the future. So the thing that's different about Teray versus Caranci is that, and we find this out because of his association with Amber, is that Teray has some latent abilities to use healer powers, and Caranci doesn't, which is allows him to kind of see inside the bodies of other people with his mind, if you will, and allows him to fight against the Clayarchs in the same way that Amber does, where he can explode their internal organs. And other patternists are not able to fight in this way. And that's what Rael finds valuable in him. But I think there's something else here about like a possible alternative way of existing as a society, and a rejection of that alternate path where things go more towards a patriarchal, like the patriarchy that's already in place is supported and perpetuated going forward. And so Amber's way of doing things, in other words, is kind of like a literal metaphor for empathy and understanding. Like she can literally feel what it's like to be inside other people's bodies in a way that like other people cannot. And she also, in terms of her sexuality, is bisexual, and so she feels attraction and love for any gender. And she can therefore kind of make like romantic networks or connections with anybody. Whereas, in the pattern, they value male-female relationships because of their ability to produce more members of the pattern and keep the society of the pattern going. And so all bodies need to be dominated for the purposes of sexual reproduction, just like in a classic patriarchy. But what if Amber were in charge of the pattern, I guess, is the kind of question that I think the book in a very oblique way kind of asks, because you can see that it would be quite different. Probably there would be, for one thing, she probably wouldn't be using her powers so much to attack people as to help them. And maybe this monstrous quality that exists within the Clayarchers could even be processed or understood or removed by this ability. But that possibility is not even explored because Teray and Caranci just see things in terms of like masculine power dynamics, that their father must die, their brother must die. There can only be one person who controls power, and everyone else is a rival who needs to be displaced. So cooperation can't happen, only supremacy and dominance. Despite that, Teray constantly throughout the book is trying to get away from Caranci. He's trying to submit to him. He's trying to defer his right to the pattern. He doesn't want to be a rival. He is always trying to find some way to get out of the pattern. He talks about possibly running away from their society altogether with Amber, or finding some way to live with her under Caranci, like just let Caranci have the pattern and then, get married to Amber and live a quiet life inside of the pattern. And so Teray's desires are anti-patriarchal, but and that's the thing maybe that I find so surprising and unique about the story, is that the coming of age is the shedding of this anti-patriarchal tendency and coming into a more brutal grab for power where his brother is killed, his father is killed, and finally he's the pattern master. And while Amber is still there and she's a presence, she is more owned than, a co-equal peer. And the entire arrangement of the pattern requires that Teray be the master and that everybody else kind of be his slave. And the way that the rest of the series is going to work is with each book, Butler moves into the past And so the next book takes place like more than 100 years in the past. And the book after that, another 100 something years in the past. And then after that, it's even deeper in the past. And so this idea of society, this brutal control, this mutant psychic powers, and these kind of monstrous Clayark creatures is the end state for the history of the books that we read going forward. And this is what I think gives a different flavor to the Patternist series if you read it in the published order, because there's like a determinism to the universe, an inescapable kind of tragedy to all of history, that it ends up in this place. That and that there But also there's like this little glimmer of hope, I guess, too, because you still do have Amber the healer holding out this other alternative to the patternist system, that there is another way to connect to people, that there's a different way to understand them, and that maybe this will come around in some way again. But we're going to see again and again throughout the books this tension between healers and the people who wield power, and how there's a kind of, for Butler, a fundamental incompatibility between power and empathy that will cause power to dominate and assert supremacy over the healer impulse every time. And so the fact that history kind of ends in this structure where there's a kind of fruitless war that certainly is going to like end in the extinction of everyone, probably the Clayarkers and the Patternists, not to mention the Mutes, is a really important thing to have like hanging over the rest of the narrative. That we need to like understand that everything else that we learn about the history of this world leading up to this point kind of teaches us where this kind of thinking eventually leads us to. And so I think there's like a strong political allegory that Butler builds, but it also has to do with like personal stories and how those interact with like larger systems of dominance and power. In Butler's world, in other words, power is systemic and identity is dominated by that systemic system. Whatever our natural impulses and drives might be to cooperate and have empathy and to help each other, those will get crushed, dominated, or the individuals will be killed by the system, is kind of the thing that happens in Pattern Master. And as we go through the books and move backward in time, you kind of see how those forces were put into place. And so that's the plan. Next time I will read Clay's Arc, which, like I said, takes place about 100 or so years before this story.